Well, that's a very generous welcome, and only one thing makes me nervous tonight, and that's the third question when we come to our Q&A later. Because in January 2007, I was the first speaker at the first international conference on liturgy and drama in Tehran. I was living in North Carolina. It was 2 nights on the plane, so I was somewhat like this when I found that I was to speak first. And I wasn't expecting a whole raft of TV cameras. And at the end of my somewhat anodyne address, the first question was, how do your remarks relate to the People's Revolution of 1979? That was the first question. Having navigated that one reasonably comfortably, the second question was, how do your remarks relate to the alien invasion of Iraq? And it was the third question that really proved the challenge. How do your remarks apply to the Zionist entity? So I'm looking out for the third question tonight, having practiced elsewhere. Improvising the realm of God. Many theologians have explored the Christian life as the performance of the Christian story. But the notion of performing a script has drawbacks. The script does not provide all the answers. Life throws up circumstances that the gospel seems not to cover. The script is unfinished. There is more to the Christian story than the pages of the Bible disclose. The notion of script can militate against genuine engagement with the world. The idea of script can suggest the recreation of a golden era, emphasizing the replication of past acts, make the church great again, rather than the discovery of new wonders. These drawbacks can encourage the church to follow predictable courses. Sometimes it lives in the past, aspiring to a world of scriptural purity. Sometimes it dismisses the script as the fruit of a bygone era or a curtailment of freedom. Sometimes it seeks to translate the script into contemporary motifs. What's required is a way of being faithful without the reassurance of a script. This is the purpose of improvisation. When improvisers are trained to work in the theatre, they're schooled in a tradition so thoroughly that they learn to act without hesitation in ways appropriate to the circumstance. My understanding of theatrical improvisation is drawn from the tradition of practitioners such as Keith Johnston, Viola Spolin, Anthony Frost, and Ralph Yarrow. Others have written on the tradition of musical improvisation, and this is a highly promising line of inquiry, but it's not my concern tonight. I begin with a story. The story of Harry was related to me by a friend called Robin. While studying for the Lutheran ministry, Robin was placed in a parish in Akron, Ohio. Harry was a member of Robin's placement parish. The pastoral staff of the parish went to see him at home once a week. They generally brought a tape of the Sunday service, a pew slip, and the sacrament. It tended to be the last roll handed out at the staff meeting. The time came for Robin to take her turn on the visiting rota and discover why. When Robin first called on Harry, she got a shock. Harry lived in a run-down white clapboard house. He was a big person sitting in an overstuffed armchair with an oxygen tank beside it. His legs were virtually useless. The house was pervaded by a smell of must, urine, and dirt. It was repulsive. Nonetheless, Robin went a second time, and gradually Harry came to trust that she would return regularly. As he realized he was not going to be rejected by her, he began to talk more about himself and the way he saw things. Yet he seldom said much about his debilitating physical condition or the squalor in which he was living. One day, Harry said to Robin, "It's time for you to have a look in the cellar." Reluctantly and somewhat uneasily, Robin walked to the cellar door. She carefully opened it and looked into the darkness. "Go down the steps," Harry insisted, realizing her hesitancy. To Robin's astonishment, she saw a large and imposing weaver's loom set up in the basement. There were piles of old clothes and torn strips of cloth. Robin stared in amazement. After trying for some time without success to relate the creativity of what she saw to the dirt and smell of the man she knew, she came back up the stairs totally bemused. Harry instructed Robin to bring him a pile of rugs from the kitchen. He took them from her and put them down in front of him and began to tell the story of his life. He explained that he took in any old clothes that nobody wanted and scraps of cloth from the rubbish heap. He then wove them into something new. The something new was the pile of rag rugs she had found stacked in his kitchen. He then gave what he had made to people who needed a rug. Why did he do it? Because, he said, he felt he was like the old clothes and the waste cloth. He was on the rubbish heap of life, alienated from his friends and his family, unable to work, unable even to breathe properly. He gave Robin his finest rug. Some weeks later, she conducted his funeral. The time came for her to return to her seminary and complete her studies. At one tutorial, she shared Harry's story with a group of her colleagues. After the session, a fellow student touched Robin's arm, took her to one side and said, "Harry was my uncle." The student was in tears, for she realized that she had lost her chance of reconciliation with him. She'd thought of Harry as a pariah, but she could now see he was a saint. Robin retrieved her precious rug, which Harry had given her, and gave it to her fellow student. Even after his death, Harry's ministry was transforming the lives of people whom he touched. As Robin told me the story, she added finally, "I am still moved by his witness." I shall now explore improvisation in 4 stages. The Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. The Duke of Wellington's famous reflection on the climax of the Napoleonic Wars was not a statement of personal modesty. It was a recognition that success in battle depends on the character of one's soldiers. It was an observation that Britain had institutions that formed people with the kind of virtues that could survive and even thrive in the demanding circumstances of war. The Duke's claim is that one cannot understand Waterloo without understanding Eton. In fact, what went on in places like Eton was more important than what went on at Waterloo. At Eton, people were trained to shoulder the kind of responsibility they were later to encounter at Waterloo. The real decisions that took place at Waterloo, decisions that shaped the future of European history, had been taken many years earlier. The Duke is saying that ethics is about people, not about actions. The heart of ethics lies in the formation of character. Once out in the battlefield, it is too late. The Duke's claim sits well with the revival in contemporary moral theology of an ethic of virtue. An ethic of virtue says morality is not just about doing the right thing in a crisis, but being a good person all the time. It's therefore not about isolated actions, but about agents. It's not about moments of decision, but about formation. It's not about universal quandaries, but about personal qualities. It's not about what it's right for all to do, but about what it's good for some to be. It's about character. The Duke's words incline us to focus on the significance of training in moral habit. This is what the Duke called Eton. Training requires commitment, discipline, faithfulness, study, apprenticeship, practice, cooperation, observation, reflection. The point of this formation is to form skills and habits. Habits that mean people take the right things for granted, and skills that give them the ability to do the things they take for granted. When Waterloo comes, it separates those whose character has been appropriately formed from those whose has not. Just as children can't become adults in an instant, so in every moral situation, the real decisions are ones that have been taken some time before. This is what the foolish bridesmaids discovered when their lamp oil ran out in the parable of judgment in Matthew 25. To live well requires both effort and habit. There is a place for both, but great ingenuity or effort at the time of decision will seldom make up for effort neglected in the time of formation. The practice of theatrical improvisation is perceived to be about spontaneity, the moment, but it too is in fact about years of experiments. Like Wellington's Eton, it is also about long preparation before following instinct. Last month, I conducted a service celebrating the 9 living recipients of the Victoria Cross and the 11 living recipients of the George Cross. They are an astonishing group. Each one described their story as acting from instinct rather than making a decision. Secondly, assessing status. The great cry of liberation theology is a cry for theology to take seriously its context. This turn towards context is a significant step in uniting ethics and theology. But the insight that comes from theatrical improvisation takes us a step further. It points out that context is an issue not just when there is a notable difference in wealth, education, class, privilege, working pattern, or living conditions. Context is an issue in any and every interaction between two or more people. And this is not a static context of environmental situation or conventional social role. It's not something that people accept because they are. It's something that people choose in the way they do, the way they relate to a given other. Do they act and speak in a way that assumes superiority or inferiority, dominance or submission? This is the choice that improvisers call status. Status informs every single interaction between people. No casual movement or gesture is without significance. There are no innocent remarks or meaningless pauses. Part of the force of the story of Harry and Robin is the slippery status of Robin. A trainee who does the job her seniors avoid becomes the student of the remarkable outcast Harry and then a teacher of his niece. Compare 3 teachers. One was well liked but couldn't keep control of the class. She frequently touched her face, often blinked, tended to twitch and laugh nervously. She invariably arrived breathless and late for class and apologized for doing so, and regularly started sentences with a short as if she was interrupting the pupil's concentration. A second teacher was widely disliked but had no trouble keeping discipline and had no need to resort to punishments or threats. He sat nervously still. He paused before each reply or pronouncement and sometimes interjected a long before he spoke. His head remained still while he spoke, and he never touched his face. He often used pupils' names when he spoke to them. A third teacher was genuinely loved. She seldom punished, but still kept the attention and interest of the class. She smiled easily, walked tall, but was always relaxed. The atmosphere in the class could be lively and humorous, but then suddenly calm and thoughtful. The first teacher was a low-status player. The second, a compulsive high-status player. The third was a status expert who could raise and lower her own status at will. At first acquaintance, it's common to assume that high status is much more powerful than low status. But this is far from the case. A crucial breakthrough comes when actors realize that high and low status are simply alternative methods for getting one's way. The next stage is to introduce a conventional relationship and to witness the difference between the status people are and the status they play. This is the most fascinating dynamic in status interactions. It's generally known as master-servant. A common experience of this kind of status transaction is that of the customer shop assistant. The expectation is that the customer calls the tune and the assistant plays it, but the servant often knows best. I once joined a friend who was going into a superior high street outfitter. "Do you sell those little pieces of plastic you insert into a shirt to stiffen the collar?" my friend asked. The assistant proffered a handful and said, "We don't sell them, sir, we give them away." The servile language masks a high-status response and prevents it from seeming aggressive. These details provide the fascination in such interplays. The most famous master-servant relations are ones where the servant has all the power, but will lose it the very moment that either party acknowledges it is so. Thus Sir Humphrey and Prime Minister James Hacker, Jeeves and Wooster, or perhaps Tony Blair and George W. Bush. The seesawing and constant reversals of status provide the dynamism. The first stage in understanding status is to recognize that status transactions are inherent in every relationship. The second is to see that people make choices in their use of language and gesture about whether to play high or low status. The third is to appreciate that high and low are not moral designations or even measurements of relative power. They're simply alternative strategies for getting one's way. The fourth is to begin to enjoy the dynamics of status interactions displayed in the affirmation and subversion of a conventional relationship. The fifth and last dimension to perceive is the significance of the use of space. Think Germans and towels and Ibiza. These 5 dimensions of status each have significant implications for the Church and its understanding of its ethical task and its relationship with wider society. The politics of local church life is, like the life of any organisation, filled with status interactions. Consider the moment at which a date for a future meeting is arranged. One person gets out a tiny diary. Another gets out an enormous diary. Another gets out their iPad and demands the meeting wait while a Wi-Fi code is sourced. A fourth does not carry a diary but makes all arrangements through a personal secretary at the office. A fifth does not have a diary because they consider that they can remember such special events as would break their routine. A sixth has left their diary at home, forgetful as ever. Then dates are suggested. One person explains their unavailability in terms of all their upcoming dental appointments and driving lessons. Another is out of the country for the next month. A third says they will need to consult their partner. A fourth says they could make the suggested time as long as people understand that means they would be an hour late. A fifth says they could make any time, they are completely flexible. A sixth says they must be getting away, but not to worry, just go ahead and they'll try to fit in and let the others know. And then the moment comes when a date is set, whose absence is insignificant and whose is decisive. Status interactions are ubiquitous in the relationship of the local church corporately to the community it serves. How do the size, age, and design of the church building compare to other buildings in the community? Are the doors open, closed, or locked? Is the faith and activity of the church broadcast by notice board or kept a secret? What is the principal way in which church encounters local people? Through knocking on doors or written leaflets, the salesperson or mail order company? Pre-arranged meetings between representatives of organizations with common interests, the business person, or the availability of a designated representative advertised hours for particular services, the professional person? Does the local church believe it speaks for all people of goodwill in the community, or does it assume that its voice will probably be a minority view on most issues? Does it expect to lead, join, or follow? Does it call its leader pastor, minister, or priest? And what social standing does it expect its leader to have in the community? These are all questions of status. Similar questions arise when the corporate context changes from local to national. Does the church consider itself to speak for truth, which needs no defense, or for a group of beleaguered believers whose interests need upholding? Does the church spell itself with a capital C? Do its leaders title themselves Reverend or His Holiness? Does it consider itself part of government, concerned with the balance of power and the benefit of all, or does it presume that it will always be with the marginalized and oppressed, and therefore never at the castle, always at the gate? Where does the church locate its national centre of operations, and in what kind of premises? How does it institute and regard its leaders? How does it hope or assume non-Christians will regard these leaders? Will that esteem be earned, and if so, how? Or can it be taken for granted? These are all questions of status. Now, to dwell on what I think is the main one for our purposes tonight, number 3, overaccepting. In the words of Keith Johnston, there are people who prefer to say yes, and there are people who prefer to say no. Those who say yes are rewarded by the adventures they have, and those who say no are rewarded by the safety they attain. Improvisation begins when a community of people resolve to find ways of saying yes. Communities generally find several reasons why they prefer instead to say no. They tend to see saying yes as impossible, improper, or dangerous. A simple improvisation game called Word at a Time illustrates what's at stake in saying yes. The game begins with the actors sitting in a circle. One actor says a single word. This becomes the first word of a story. The actor next in the circle follows immediately with a second word. The next actor says a third, and so on, as quickly as possible, until the story is considered complete. Adverbs are disallowed in order to keep up the pace and avoid delaying tactics. Inexperienced actors invariably try to control the story, but this only succeeds in ruining it. Every person who adds a word has an incipient story in mind and thus an idea of what word might follow, but each time they must instantly wipe that idea out of their mind, or else they will be paralyzed. If the players relax, cease to worry about being obvious, remain highly attentive, and simply say whatever comes to mind, they will find the story seems to take on a life of its own, guided by some outside force. The reason improvisation seems impossible to inexperienced players is that instinctively they spend most of their time trying to avoid being dangerous. The story constantly threatens to become obscene, psychotic, or unoriginal. These all represent danger. Thus, there's a constant, irresistible temptation to kill the story. This can be done passively by saying stop or remaining silent, or actively by trying to control its future, insisting on being clever or original, or closing it without regard to its foregoing content whenever its direction threatens danger. The breakthrough in improvisation training comes when actors realize that their performance is not a linear method of getting as efficiently as possible from point A to point B. On the contrary, detours are most of the fun. This changes the whole notion of what constitutes a mistake. As one experienced director puts it, mistakes are re-evaluated as possibilities of new directions. Rightness is more a question of attitude, not of what you do, but how you do it, whether you're prepared to play with what comes along. Rather like the comedian Ronnie Corbett telling a story, the experienced improviser knows that the simplest narrative interlaced with teasing detours often makes the best drama. 3 technical terms may assist in exploring what it means to say yes. The first is the term offer. Anything an actor does may be regarded as an offer. An offer may be a speech, a facial expression or gesture, or an action, even an attempt to remain silent or still. Any of these things may be treated as an invitation to respond and thus be treated as an offer. Thus, in the game Word at a Time, each word is both a response to an offer and immediately an offer in itself. Offers are not to be regarded as good or bad in themselves. The key is what you do with them. The second term is accept. An actor accepts an offer by any response that maintains the premise of the action that constituted that offer. Imagine a child in the playground puts 2 fingers together and points them towards another child and then clicks another finger and says, "Bang, you're dead." This is an offer. The second child then has the opportunity to respond to that offer. If the child is prepared to accept the offer, they will conventionally do so by yelping a strangled cry and falling over in a crumpled heap, for this maintains the premise of the first child's offer. To do this requires the same skills of the second child that are required to play the game Word at a Time. The second child must be willing and able to wipe from their mind any thoughts they themselves had of actively controlling the outcome of the narrative and resist the inclination to passive refusal, such as, "I'm not playing anymore." The third term is block. Imagine once again that the first child acts a shot and says, "Bang, you're dead." If the second child were actively to refuse to accept the offer and fall down, but were instead to remain standing and say, "Bang, you're dead, not me," then this would be a block. Blocking prevents the action from developing. It undermines one partner's premise. It may be amusing to watch, but it kills the story. It turns a partnership into a confrontation. It happens when one actor is overwhelmed by the danger or difficulty of keeping the story going. Accepting sees the future as an opportunity. Blocking sees the future as a problem. All sorts of possibilities are ruled out by blocking. Imagine once again that the first child shoots and says, "Bang, you're dead." This time the second child accepts the offer. Now the second child may begin to explore the afterlife of the dead soldier, and perhaps reappear to the first soldier as a ghost or angel. But this only becomes possible if the original death, the first offer, is accepted. Now the story can really develop, as the first child may be introduced to other angels, fall in love with one of them, have to choose whether to die in order to be united with their beloved, and so on. What would it be like to be committed never to block, always to accept? What would it be like to be surrounded by people who are committed to the practice of accepting all offers? The interactions in such a community seem telepathic. It looks like everything has already been arranged. There's no such thing as an accident or an interruption. Everything becomes an offer that can be accepted. The actor who will accept anything that happens seems supernatural. It's the most marvelous thing about improvisation. You're suddenly in contact with people who are unbounded, whose imagination seems to function without limit. People with dull lives often think that their lives are dull by chance. In reality, everyone chooses more or less what kind of events will happen to them by their conscious patterns of blocking and yielding. One author goes even further on this point. Improvisation is not exchange of information between players, it is communion. Blocking appears to some as faithful resilience, but in that it buries its talent in the hillside, it may anticipate the punishment handed out to the third slave. And in that it sets its stall against the inevitable tide of time, it may anticipate the heritage of King Canute. I argue that for the church to block is not desirable, necessary, or possible. This brings us to a simple but immensely significant game, which demonstrates the suggestive power of improvisation for Christian ethics. The game is called presents. It's played in pairs. A thinks of a present they would like to give to B, and then mimes giving it to them. B has to guess what it is and use it accordingly. The players then swap roles, and B passes a mimed present to person A, and so on. The trouble with this game is, of course, that it can be difficult to identify what the gift is. The players can get frustrated with each other as each mimes more and more outlandish gifts, leaving the other more and more bewildered. Each actor seems in competition and feels it. How can this change? The secret to making the game a success is not to think of interesting things to give, but to concentrate on making the thing one is given as interesting as possible. If A simply holds out two hands, as if proffering something in a box, B may be delighted to receive an array of possible gifts. Everything you're given delights you. Maybe you wind it up and let it walk about the floor, or you sit it on your arm and let it fly off after a small bird, or maybe you put it on and turn into a gorilla. If the game is played this way, the stifling sense of competition disappears and great joy and energy are released. The change to the game might be simple, but the change in thinking is enormous. All offers are now potential gifts. When the burden of the game lies with the giver requires the kind of imagination that determines the future. Great frustration arises if the gift is misinterpreted. When, by contrast, the emphasis lies with the receiver, the imagination cooperates, adapts, and develops. I want to suggest to you now that what the gift game pictures is a revolution in thinking about Christian ethics. Ethics, as it is generally described, is invariably perceived as a matter of choosing when to say yes and when to say no. But the presents game shows that, in fact, person B has three options when offered a present by person A. B can say first, no, I am not going to receive this gift. Saying no appears in the short term to maintain one's own security and integrity. This is the approach associated with the Essene sect of first century Palestine. Throughout Christian history, there have always been groups that said no to some or all gifts that came their way from wider society. The strict brethren might be said to represent this position today. It's the position H.R. Niebuhr described as Christ against culture. There are many things to which it is often said the wider church should say no. The list sometimes includes slavery and murder, often nuclear weapons and embryo research, perhaps abortion, euthanasia, sometimes betting slips, tobacco and alcohol. Most churches have recognized that one cannot say no to one's culture wholesale. To do so is to deny the goodness of God's creation and to declare war on society. So what else can B do? B can say, second, what is this gift? What is it for? What am I supposed to do with it? This is the way the game is usually played, as I've described earlier. It's also the way the game is usually played in Christian ethics. B accepts the gift, but doesn't know what the gift is. The dilemma of B as to the nature of the gift corresponds to the moment of decision that is the focus of quandary ethics. For just as the present is given by A in the game, so are the circumstances given at moments of decision. And the decision maker must adjudicate between them. And just as the game is frustrating when played this way, so is decision making and ethics that concentrates on decisions often immensely trying. The assumption is often made that there is a right thing to do in each circumstance. Such reasoning is often based on natural law. Natural law arguments tend to assume that everything was created for a purpose and that when it's employed about its correct purpose, all is well. This is the position of B, desperately wondering what this gift is for. There is a third option. Person B can say, third, how do I want to receive this gift? This is the transition that I've described in the way the gift game is played earlier. It's not a question of what the gift is supposed to be. It's a question of what the gift can be. One doesn't say, what is this gift for? And even less, is this a good gift? One says, how can this gift be understood or used in a faithful way? What does the way we accept this gift say about the kind of people we are and want to be? What can or has this gift become in the kingdom of God? The ethical issues are less about the gift itself than about where it's perceived to fit into the story of the way God deals with God's people and how that fitting in takes place. This is called overaccepting. Overaccepting is accepting in the light of a larger story. The fear about accepting is that one will be determined by the gift and thus lose one's integrity and identity. The fear about blocking is that one will seal oneself off from the world and thus lose one's relevance and humanity. Overaccepting is an active way of receiving that enables one to retain both identity and relevance. It's a way of accepting without losing the initiative. This often involves a change of status. Diana, Princess of Wales, I don't know if you remember her, but if you've lived in this country for a while, the name may be familiar. She was asked in a television interview whether she thought she would ever be queen. Do you remember what she said? She famously replied, "I will be queen of people's hearts." Thus not blocking the awkwardness of her predicament, but over-accepting the sadness of losing her throne and placing herself in what she saw as a far more significant narrative. The coal miners of the film, the Full Monty, had been stripped of their dignity by the experience of unemployment. They over-accepted their condition by developing a thriving male stripper routine. Robin's friend Harry didn't block the squalor of his ill health and living conditions, but over-accepted them by converting rubbish into items of usefulness and beauty. Over-accepting imitates the manner of God's reign, for God does not block creation or toss away the original material. Since Noah, God has refused to destroy what has been made, but neither does God accept creation on its own terms. Instead, God over-accepts creation, seeing what it can be, and by the way the Holy Spirit incorporates it into God's realm, through election, incarnation, passion, resurrection, and the sending of the Spirit, demonstrates God's character. Christians imitate the character of God to the extent that they over-accept the gifts of creation and culture in the same way God does. The story is told of a concert pianist who was on the point of beginning a performance when there was a scream from the audience. A child had left her seat beside her parent and was running round the auditorium. The concert pianist stepped away from his instrument in order to maintain concentration. The child ran up the steps onto the stage, sat herself down on the stool, and began to play discordant notes at random as she pleased. The hushed audience gasped in horror and embarrassment. The pianist walked towards the child and stood behind her as she played. The pianist leant over to her and, without disturbing her, placed right and left hands outside her two small hands on the keyboard. The pianist then began to play in response to her notes, weaving their discordant sounds into an improvised melody. To have thrown the child out would have been to block. To have let her play on would have been to accept. To weave a wonderful melody around her was to receive her as a gift, to overaccept. Similar practice is common among instrumental performers when they make mistakes in their play, incorporating what they call passing notes into their performance rather than calling a halt. And just as a little pause, 3/4 of the way through, a week ago yesterday, I had a very moving conversation with an old friend who's just turned 70, and her husband, who's the same age, has just been diagnosed with dementia. And he slipped out to the bathroom, and I had a quiet moment just with her, and I said to her, "So how is it really?" And she said, "God has given me an opportunity to expand my capacity to love." That's overaccepting. Okay, and finally, reincorporating the lost. The revelation brought by the liberation movement in the church in the last 50 years is that the earth cast aside in making a road is at least as much a part of the story as the road itself. That the marble discarded by a sculptor is at least as much a part of the display as the sculpture. It's now much easier to see for poor and rich alike that the losers whose voice has not been heard are at least as much a part of church history as those winners who have written it. Those who told stories to children will have experienced that vacant, wondering expression that children sometimes have, which makes a razor-sharp allegiance to the conventions of storytelling. Should one try to miss out chunks of the plot or finish before the end of the story, one suffers the accusing wrath of the deeply wronged. This is the case even if one is making up the story as one is going along. How do children know whether one has or has not reached the end of the story? The key to improvising children's stories is not in thinking up clever or original characters or contexts, but in remembering what has been discarded and reintroducing it at the appropriate moment. Likewise, the key to improvising on the Christian story is not in being clever or original, but in being so steeped in the discarded elements of the story that one can draw on them when the vital moment comes. A story is not simply a series of events happening one after another. Such sequences have no reason for stopping in any one place rather than any other. It's not simply a matter of free association. A story requires reincorporation. Reincorporation is what marks the end of the story. When elements found earlier in the story begin to be reincorporated, then some pattern emerges and a sense of completion is possible. Christian ethics, seen from an eschatological perspective, is always profoundly aware of the end of the story and of the way this end reincorporates earlier, perhaps all earlier, parts of the narrative. It's reincorporation that distinguishes the end from just another event in the narrative. Reincorporation brings together notions of the end of the story as telos or purpose and the end of the story as conclusion. The key factor in reincorporation is memory. Memory is much more significant than originality. The improviser does not set out to create the future, but responds to the past, reincorporating to form a story. This can be illustrated by a game in which actor A provides free associated disconnected material, while actor B somehow tries to connect it. Actor A: "It was a cold winter's night. The wolves howled in the trees. The concert pianist adjusted his sleeves and began to play. An old lady was shoveling snow from the door." Actor B: "When she heard the piano, the little old lady began shoveling at a fantastic speed. When she reached the concert hall, she cried, 'That pianist is my son!' Wolves appeared at all the windows, and the pianist sprang onto the piano, thick fur growing visibly from under his clothes." The Christian community is in a position much more similar to actor B than to actor A. The community is not able to determine the gifts it is given. It's obliged to use the skill of its convictions to transform the fate or givenness of the disconnected gifts into the destiny of a story consonant with the one given story. It does not do this by changing the subject or by refusing to continue. Both of these would do violence to the emerging narrative. This perspective sees all events in creation as offering possibilities for narrative, needing skills nurtured by the gospel to be reincorporated. The key to successful improvisation is not originality but memory. The more easily forgotten an element is, the more satisfying its reincorporation. Likewise, the deeper the exclusion of a person from the church's story, the more significant their reincorporation in the story. As was pointed out to Simon the Pharisee, the repentance of the woman who washed Jesus' feet with her hair was more significant than Simon's own repentance. In a highly suggestive phrase, one author on theatrical improvisation emphasizes that the skills required for improvisation are not primarily those that come in moments of inspiration or decision. Instead, the future is formed out of the past. The improviser has to be like a person walking backwards. They see where they have been, but they pay no attention to the future. Their story can take them anywhere, but they must still balance it and give it shape by remembering incidents that have been shelved and reincorporating them. Likewise, Robin's friend Harry reincorporated that which others had discarded in his rag rugs. By so doing, he reincorporated broken relationships and overaccepted blocked fellowship, thus embodying the kingdom. My final story happened, it happened in 1992 and concerns Bill. Bill left school in a town where one went down the mine, constructed aircraft turbines, or learnt to build warships. So he did an apprenticeship in the shipyard and looked forward to a lifetime of employment. He progressed well, moving upstairs to the office where he ordered parts for future ships. He married, had 2 children, got a car and a mortgage. All was well. Then one day, along with almost everyone else at the company, he lost his job. His wife worked part-time at the post office and was a highly capable person. She took on a full-time post and Bill set to cooking and cleaning. It wasn't enough. They realized they'd have to sell the house. Bill set about decorating the house to make it attractive to a buyer. His efforts were lamentable. He lived in fear of his highly competent wife and her withering criticism, sharpened by her exhaustion. The 2 daughters of the house witnessed daily increasing tension. Determined to maintain their Easter observance, the family faithfully shared in the witness of Holy Week, its commemoration of the Passion being borne out in their thinly veiled torture. Finally, on Holy Saturday, the explosion came. Bill's wife returned after work, desperate to grab some tea and get out to the Easter Vigil, but was stopped in her tracks by the smell of paint. Bill was on the stairs, his ladder through an involuntary hole in the ceiling, and the contents of an upset paint pot trickling down the stair carpet. She shrieked, "What's the use of you? You can't get a job. You can't cook, can't keep the house tidy, and put a paintbrush in your hand and you wreck the whole house. You're useless, pointless, hopeless." The silence was louder than the shouting that preceded it, as Bill accepted each word. But his daughter, a precocious 11-year-old, intervened. She looked up the stairs at her father and back down to her mother. "He's a good dad," she said simply. In 5 words, she'd taken the right things for granted, recognized as a child it was not her responsibility to make everything come out right, blocked nothing of what her mother had said, questioned the givens her mother had been assuming, over-accepted her mother's words, and reincorporated the forgotten part of the story, the part that genuinely belonged in the final act of God's drama. All the stages of improvisation in 5 words. Her simple words brought her mother to humble repentance. The mother tearfully related the story to me later the same day.